Mom, what on earth is this? For 26 years, my parents forced me and my wife to handle over 200 memorial services all on our own. But on that day, I accidentally saw my mother's bank book, and something was terribly wrong. There were records of hundreds, even thousands of dollars being withdrawn every single month. The names of my successful siblings, Julian and Sophia, were everywhere. But not once in all those years did the name Arthur appear. On the day of the great memorial, the 53-year-old anger of an eldest son finally boiled over. What choice will Arthur make after discovering this betrayal? Thank you for visiting our channel for these life stories. Before we begin, please like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can send our warmest wishes your way. Now, let us begin today's story. The winter wind howled through the narrow, fog-laden streets of Boston, carrying the sharp scent of salt from the Atlantic and the biting chill of a New England January. The city was a ghost of itself at this hour, wrapped in a heavy, slate-gray mist that clung to the brownstone buildings like a damp shroud. Streetlights flickered rhythmically, casting long, shivering shadows across the icy pavement, where the frost had already begun to claim the world. Inside a modest apartment on the edge of the city, the silence was absolute until the sharp, persistent chirp of an alarm pierced the air. It was 4:30 a.m. Arthur, a man in his early 50s with silver-streaked hair, deep-set eyes framed by weary lines, and a frame toughened by decades of manual labor, reached out a calloused hand to silence the noise before the first cycle could finish. His movements were practiced and fluid, born of 18 years of the same ritual. Beside him, the bed shifted slightly. Clara, Arthur's wife, a woman whose once bright eyes were now often shadowed by fatigue, her posture slightly stooped from years of service and endless domestic toil, stirred in her sleep but did not wake. She had only returned from her late-night shift at the local supermarket a few hours prior, her body still recovering from the grueling pace of stocking shelves and standing at the register. Arthur held his breath, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her shoulders. He slipped out from under the heavy blankets with the stealth of a thief, his bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor without a sound. He didn't turn on the bedroom light. He didn't need to. He knew every inch of this space, every creak in the floorboard he needed to avoid. In the bathroom, the harsh glow of the fluorescent bulb revealed a face etched with the history of his sacrifices. The shadows under his eyes were like bruises, and the deep furrows on his forehead seemed to have grown deeper overnight. He splashed ice-cold water on his face, the shock of it finally clearing the fog of sleep from his brain. As he moved toward the kitchen, he passed the dining table and stopped. There, wrapped carefully in plastic wrap, sat two neatly packed sandwiches and a thermos of hot black coffee. Beside them lay a small, pale blue sticky note. "Today, we have to take your mother to the hospital after your shift. Don't forget," the note read in Clara's neat, looping cursive. Arthur felt a familiar pang in his chest. Clara had prepared this before she had even gone to her own job the night before, thinking of his hunger and his family's needs, even when her own legs were likely throbbing with pain. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into the pocket of his heavy work jacket, his fingers lingering on the paper. Stepping outside, the cold hit him like a physical blow, the 18-degree C warmth of the apartment replaced by a sub-zero gust that turned his breath into white plumes of steam. He walked briskly toward his delivery truck, the gravel crunching under his boots like breaking glass. When he climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine groaned and sputtered before finally roaring into a rhythmic, rattling life. He sat there for a moment, waiting for the heater to kick in, his hands shaking slightly from the cold. As he drove toward the massive logistics center on the outskirts of Boston, his mind drifted back 26 years. He remembered the day they were married in a small chapel in Providence. He had held Clara's hands, soft, smooth, and full of hope back then, and promised her a life of peace. He had envisioned a future where they would build a legacy together, free from the crushing weight of obligation. But the reality of being the eldest son in a family bound by rigid tradition had slowly eroded that promise. Over those 26 years, their lives had been measured not in personal milestones, but in the 200 memorial dinners and family feasts Clara had prepared single-handedly. He saw her hands in his mind, the hands that used to play the piano, now covered in kitchen burns and thickened by the lie of cleaning products. He reached the warehouse just before 5 a.m. The facility was a hive of industrial chaos. Conveyor belts hummed with a mechanical roar, and the air was thick with the smell of diesel and cardboard dust. Sam, a younger driver in his early 30s, energetic but observant, who looked up to Arthur as a mentor, approached him with a lopsided grin. "Morning, Art. You're always the first one here. Don't you ever sleep?" Sam asked, hoisting a heavy crate onto his cart. "Sleeping doesn't pay the bills, Sam," Arthur replied with a faint, tired smile. "You okay? Your back's acting up again, isn't it?" Sam noticed the way Arthur winced as he lifted a 20-kilo box. "I'm fine. Just need to get moving." Arthur dismissed the concern, though a sharp, white-hot needle of pain shot through his lower spine. He had been ignoring the doctor's advice to rest for 5 years, because a day off was a day without a paycheck. His first stop was a high-rise apartment complex. When he arrived, a sign on the door announced that the elevator was out of service. Arthur stared at the sign for a long beat, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. He didn't have time to wait for a technician. He loaded 3 heavy boxes into his arms and began the climb to the 5th floor. By the 3rd flight, his breath was coming in ragged gasps and his calf muscles were screaming. By the 5th, his arms were trembling so violently he nearly dropped the packages. He set them down and rang the bell. "Just leave them at the door," a sharp voice called out from inside without opening it. Arthur wiped the sweat from his brow, nodded to the closed door, and turned back to the stairs. He had 149 more deliveries to go. Around noon, he pulled his truck into a quiet side street to finally eat. He unwrapped the sandwich Clara had made. It was turkey and Swiss, his favorite. As he took a bite, he felt the weight of his phone in his pocket. He pulled it out to find the family group chat buzzing with activity. His mother had posted a reminder about the upcoming memorial service for his great-grandfather. Below it, his younger siblings had chimed in with, "Count me in," and "See you there." Then came the specific instructions for him. Clara needed to fry the cod cakes and prepare 3 types of sides, and Arthur needed to handle the high-end fruit baskets because the ones the others brought last year were too small. Arthur stared at the screen, the sandwich suddenly tasting like ash in his mouth. He didn't reply. He couldn't. He reached into his jacket pocket to find a napkin, but his hand brushed against something else. It was another note, hidden deeper in his pocket than the first one. This one was folded small, almost as if Clara hadn't intended for him to find it right away. He unfolded it with trembling fingers. "Arthur," it began, "I saw you checking the bank balance last night. Please don't worry about the medical bills for my back. I took an extra shift at the store this weekend. I am still okay, really. Don't worry about me. Just focus on getting through the week. I love you." The words blurred before his eyes. He knew she wasn't okay. He had seen her gripping the kitchen counter in agony just yesterday. He knew she was working herself into a grave to cover the costs of his family's endless demands and his own failing health. The silence of the truck cabin was suddenly broken by a ragged sob. Arthur slumped over the steering wheel, the crumpled note clutched against his chest. He cried for the promise he hadn't kept, for the 200 days of her life she had given to people who didn't even say thank you, and for the sheer, crushing unfairness of it all. Outside, the Boston fog began to thin, but the cold remained, deep and unyielding, much like the life he was trapped in. He took a deep breath, wiped his eyes with his sleeve, and started the engine. There was still a long road ahead. The afternoon sun in Providence was a pale, heatless disk hanging low over the tree-lined streets, casting long, skeletal shadows of oak branches across the sidewalk. Arthur pulled his truck into the driveway of their small home, the engine giving one final, exhausted shudder before falling silent. His back felt as though it had been fused into a single piece of rusted iron, and every movement to climb out of the cab was a negotiation with pain. As he stepped onto the pavement, he saw Mrs. Gable, a neighbor in her late 80s who lived in the Victorian house next door, her silver hair always tucked under a knitted beret, and her eyes sharp enough to spot a weed from a block away, tending to her winter bird feeders. "Back late again, Arthur," she called out, her voice thin but clear in the crisp air. "Just the usual Friday rush, Mrs. Gable," Arthur replied, forcing a polite smile despite the throbbing in his spine. Mrs. Gable leaned on her porch railing, her gaze drifting to the stacks of empty grocery crates in the back of Arthur's truck. I saw Clara lugging in 3 bags of flour and a whole crate of produce earlier. Another one of those family services tomorrow, I gather. Grandfather's memorial, Arthur said simply. The old woman tutted, a sound of disapproval she didn't bother to hide. 26 years I've watched you too. I see Julian's fancy SUV roll in 10 minutes before the prayers start, and Sophia's New York car speeding off before the dishes are even cleared. Why aren't those two here now, helping Clara lift those heavy pots? Arthur looked down at his boots, the leather scuffed and salt-stained. They have busy lives, Mrs. Gable. Julian's firm is expanding, and Sophia, she has her academy. Busy lives, Mrs. Gable echoed with a dry laugh. We're all busy, Arthur, but some people are busy living, and others are just busy being served. That wife of yours is a saint, but even saints have breaking points. Arthur didn't have an answer for her. He offered a quick nod and retreated into his house, her words trailing after him like a cold draft. The smell of boiling vinegar and slow-simmering spices filled the kitchen. Clara was standing over the stove, her back to him. She didn't turn around immediately, but he could see the way she leaned her weight on her left hip to ease the pressure on her lower back. On the counter sat a mountain of potatoes waiting to be peeled and a stack of codfish being soaked for the traditional cakes. "You're home," she said, her voice sounding thin through the steam. "I am." Arthur walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. He could feel the tension in her muscles, tight as a bowstring. "You should sit, Clara. I'll take over the peeling." "There isn't time," she whispered, finally turning to look at him. Her face was flushed from the heat of the stove, but her eyes looked glazed with exhaustion. "Your mother called 3 times while you were driving. She wants the premium salmon now, not just the cod. She said the Miller cousins are coming, and we can't look cheap." Before Arthur could respond, his phone vibrated in his pocket. The caller ID showed Margaret, his mother, a woman who viewed the family's social standing in the Providence community as a sacred trust and believed that the eldest son was the natural executor of that legacy. "Arthur, are you there?" His mother's voice was sharp. "I'm here, Mother." "I hope you've checked the list I sent. I decided we need to add the imported wine and the organic fruit baskets. The ones from the local market last time were adequate, but we need to show proper respect for your grandfather's memory." "Mother, the budget for this is already twice what we planned," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave as he glanced at Clara. "It's not about the money, Arthur. It's about the name. Julian and Sophia are bringing guests from New York. You wouldn't want them to be embarrassed by their own brother, would you? You're the eldest. This is your responsibility." "I understand," Arthur said, though his stomach twisted in a knot. "Good. And make sure Clara does the tarts from scratch. The store-bought ones are an insult." The line went dead. Arthur looked at the stack of grocery receipts on the counter. He took the truck back out to the high-end specialty market in the city, the one where the prices were meant for people with Julian's salary, not his. He pushed the cart through the aisles, feeling like an interloper among the polished floors and the soft classical music. He picked out the salmon Margaret insisted on. He found the wine that cost more than his weekly fuel budget. He selected the organic fruits, each one polished to a sickening shine. Every item he added to the cart felt like a stone being placed in a bag he was forced to carry. At the checkout, he watched the digital display. $40, $100, $250. The total climbed with a ruthless, rhythmic beep. By the time the cashier stopped, the final number stared back at him like an accusation. 412 USD. It was almost exactly what he had earned for an entire month of overtime deliveries, the money he had promised Clara they would put toward the repairs for their leaking roof. "Sir, credit or debit?" The cashier, a teenager who looked bored by the weight of Arthur's world, prompted him. Arthur felt the sweat prickling at his hairline. He reached into his wallet and pulled out his credit card, the one he had promised himself he would only use for emergencies. His hand shook as he inserted it into the reader. He thought of the roof. He thought of Clara's back. He thought of his mother's voice talking about respect. The machine processed for a long, agonizing 10 seconds. Approved. He walked out to the truck, the heavy bag straining his fingers. He sat in the driver's seat and leaned his head against the steering wheel. He wasn't just tired anymore. He was hollowed out. 26 years of these traditions had built a cage around him, and the bars were made of receipts and unwashed dishes. He drove home through the darkening streets of Providence, the bags of respect shifting in the back of the truck. As he pulled back into the driveway, he saw Mrs. Gable's porch light flick on. She was still there, a silent witness to the ghost he had become. Inside, the kitchen was hotter now, the air thick with the smell of the 200th sacrifice. Clara looked up, her face etched with a question she didn't need to ask. Arthur just set the bags down on the counter and took the peeler from her hand. "Go lie down, Clara," he said, his voice sounding like dry leaves. "I've got the rest." She didn't argue this time. She just touched his arm, a brief, desperate squeeze, and walked slowly toward the bedroom. Arthur stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the expensive food he couldn't afford, preparing a feast for people who would never understand the cost of a single bite. The Saturday morning air in Providence was crisp and deceptively bright, the kind of New England winter day that looked warm through a window, but bit like a needle the moment you stepped outside. Arthur had been awake since before dawn, finishing the prep work he had started the night before. The kitchen smelled of roasted meats and the sharp, briny tang of cod cakes, a scent that had permeated the very wallpaper of their home over the last 26 years. By noon, the quiet street was disturbed by the low, expensive hum of high-performance engines. Arthur, standing in his driveway with grease-stained hands, looked up as two vehicles turned the corner. The first was a sleek, midnight blue electric SUV that seemed to glide over the asphalt rather than drive on it. Out stepped Julian, Arthur's younger brother, a man who wore his success like a tailored suit, with teeth a shade too white, and an air of impatient importance that suggested his time was billed by the second. Behind him followed a luxury sedan, driven by Sophia, the youngest sibling, an elegant woman with a sharp bob and a penchant for designer scarves, whose smile rarely reached her eyes and whose voice always carried a hint of a lecture. Accompanying Julian was his wife Vanessa, a woman who viewed the suburbs of Providence as a quaint, slightly dusty museum, constantly checking her phone and adjusting her expensive sunglasses as if the New England sun were an affront to her. "Art, look at you, always working on something," Julian called out, not offering a handshake but instead gesturing toward Arthur's delivery truck. The truck's hood was popped open, revealing an engine that looked like a chaotic puzzle of rusted pipes and leaking seals. "It's an old beast, Julian. Needs a little coaxing to keep going," Arthur said, wiping his hands on a rag that was already black with oil. "Coaxing? You need to scrap it," Julian laughed, leaning against the pristine door of his SUV. "I'll show you what a real machine looks like in a minute. But first, let's get these inside. Mom's been asking about the gifts." Julian and Sophia began unloading items from their trunks. They carried large, beautifully wrapped boxes into the house, a vintage whiskey set for their father, an Hermes scarf for their mother, and a high-tech massage chair that Julian bragged had cost him a small fortune. They walked right past Arthur, who was struggling to lift a crate of the expensive salmon he had bought with his credit card the night before, without so much as a "need a hand." Inside, the house was already bustling, though the bustle was entirely one-sided. Clara was a blur of movement between the oven and the sink. She had been standing for 6 hours straight, her face pale and damp with steam. "Clara, darling, the tea is a bit lukewarm," Sophia remarked as she swept into the kitchen to place her designer handbag on the only clean corner of the counter. She didn't offer to pour a fresh pot. She simply stood there, waiting. Vanessa joined her, leaning against the refrigerator. "And do we have those gluten-free crackers I mentioned?" Julian's stomach has been so sensitive since the merger. Clara didn't look up. She was scrubbing a heavy cast-iron pan, her shoulders shaking slightly from the effort. "They're in the pantry, Vanessa, next to the napkins," she said, her voice tight. From the living room, the sounds of laughter and the clinking of expensive crystal drifted into the kitchen. Arthur's siblings were reclining on the sofa, regaling their parents with tales of New York galas and real estate ventures. To them, the feast appearing on the table was a force of nature, something that simply happened, like the tide coming in. They didn't see the beads of sweat on Clara's upper lip or the way she winced every time she had to reach for a high shelf. Arthur came in through the back door, his back screaming at him to sit down. He saw Clara standing before a mountain of dirty dishes, her eyes fixed on the window, where his siblings' luxury cars were parked like trophies. She looked at the tea service Julian had brought for their mother, a set that probably cost more than Clara's supermarket salary for a month, and then at the grease on her own apron. "I'll do those, Clara. Go sit for 5 minutes," Arthur whispered, moving to her side. "I can't. Your mother wants the salmon served at exactly 1 o'clock," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, a hollow sound of total resignation. After lunch, a meal where Julian and Sophia spent more time critiquing the seasoning than thanking the cook, Julian pulled Arthur back outside. "Hey, Art, check this out," Julian said, his eyes gleaming with a boyish, arrogant pride. He tapped a button on his key fob, and the SUV's doors opened upward like the wings of a bird. The new Apex E-Series, full autonomous drive, 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds. $100,000, but worth every penny for the tax break alone. Arthur stood there, the midday sun reflecting off the SUV's flawless paint. He felt a dull, throbbing ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his manual labor. He looked past the $100,000 marvel to his own truck parked 10 feet away. The radiator on the delivery truck was hissing a sickly white vapor. Arthur knew what it was, a blown head gasket. It was a death sentence for an engine that old. He had known it was coming, but he had spent the repair money on the salmon, the wine, and the premium organic fruit his mother demanded for this very afternoon. That's a beautiful car, Julian," Arthur said, his voice cracking slightly. "Isn't it? You should really look into an upgrade, man. It's embarrassing to see you hauling gear in that prehistoric heap," Julian said, patting Arthur on the shoulder before heading back inside to finish the expensive whiskey. Arthur turned to his truck. He picked up a wrench, but his hand was shaking too much to use it. He looked at the oil leaking onto the driveway, a dark stain spreading like a wound. He was a man who spent his life delivering goods to others, ensuring everyone else had what they needed, while his own life was literally falling apart in the driveway. Inside, he could hear Sophia complaining that the dessert wasn't chilled enough. He looked at the grease under his fingernails and the luxury cars blocking his exit. For 26 years, he had believed that being the eldest meant being the shield. But as he stood in the cold afternoon air, watching his brother's $100,000 toy, he realized he wasn't a shield at all. He was just the floor they walked on to keep their shoes clean. The following Monday, the sky over Providence was the color of a bruised plum, heavy with the promise of more snow. Arthur had managed to limp his truck back home by pouring every spare cent into a temporary sealant, but the engine's rattle sounded like a death knell in his ears. He wasn't on the road today. Instead, he was at his parents' house in the older, historic district of the city. His father had requested he clear out the basement and the mahogany-paneled library, claiming the clutter was making his mother's allergies worse. Arthur worked alone. Julian and Sophia had long since fled back to their glass and steel lives in New York, leaving behind nothing but empty wine bottles and the lingering scent of expensive cologne. Henry, Arthur's father, a man who had once been a stern foreman and now occupied his days by critiquing the world from the depths of a wingback chair, sat in the living room. He was a man of few words, most of them transactional. "The boxes in the corner, Arthur. They've been there since you were a boy. Get them to the curb or the attic. I don't care which," Henry called out without looking up from his newspaper. Arthur spent hours hauling heavy crates of old records and rusted tools. His back screamed with every step, the pain a dull, constant throb that felt like a hot iron pressed against his vertebrae. He thought of Clara, who was at that very moment standing behind a deli counter in the supermarket, her own back likely echoing his. He felt a wave of guilt so thick it nearly choked him. They had eaten instant noodles for 3 nights straight last week, so they could afford the premium vitamins and organic supplements his mother insisted she needed to survive the winter. By mid-afternoon, Arthur was in the library, a room that smelled of old paper and tobacco. He moved toward an ornate oak desk, a piece of furniture that had always been off-limits during his childhood. As he pulled it away from the wall to dust behind it, the desk wobbled and a hidden compartment in the back of a drawer clicked open. A small navy blue bank book fell out. It was his mother's personal savings account. Arthur picked it up, intending to place it back, but the book fell open, and his eyes caught a glimpse of the transaction history. He shouldn't have looked, but his heart was already hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The dates were organized with terrifying precision. Every month on the 1st and the 15th, large sums were withdrawn. John 15, 2500 USD, wire transfer, Julian, investment support. Feb 01, 1800 USD, wire transfer. Sophia, Academy rental. Feb 15, 5000 USD, wire transfer, Julian asset management. The numbers blurred before his eyes. He flipped through the pages. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years back. The pattern never broke. Thousands of dollars were flowing out of this house every single month to fuel the successful lives of his siblings in the city. Arthur felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. He remembered 3 years ago when the transmission on his truck had died and he had begged his parents for a small loan. His mother had cried, clutching her chest, telling him they were living on a fixed income and barely had enough for heat. He remembered the shame he felt for even asking. He remembered Clara selling her grandmother's engagement ring to pay for the repair so he could keep working. And all the while this book had been sitting here. He kept flipping. He was looking for one name, his name, Arthur. He reached the end of the book. Then he found the second book tucked behind it. He searched every line, every withdrawal, every memo. Julian, Sophia, Julian, Sophia, Julian. The name Arthur appeared nowhere. It was as if he didn't exist in their financial world, except as a source of incoming funds. He saw the deposits he had made, the monthly elderly care checks he sent, the money for the memorial services, the emergency funds for his mother's fictional crises. His money went in, and almost immediately it was wired out to New York. "Arthur, are you finished in there? I'm getting hungry," Margaret, his mother, called from the kitchen. Margaret, a woman who moved with a practiced frailty, her voice always pitched at a frequency of quiet suffering that demanded immediate attention, entered the library. She saw him standing there, the bank book clutched in his shaking hand. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. "What are you doing with that?" she asked, her voice losing its softness, turning sharp and defensive. "I found it, Mother. Behind the drawer," Arthur said, his voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. "I was looking for the fixed income you told me about, the one that meant you couldn't help us when Clara needed surgery." Margaret didn't flinch. She snatched the book from his hand and tucked it into her apron. "You shouldn't have been prying. You're the eldest, Arthur. You're stable. You have your job, your truck, your house. You don't need help." "Stable?" Arthur let out a short, jagged laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "Clara's working 60 hours a week at a supermarket to pay for your vitamins. My truck is literally held together by tape because I spent the repair money on the salmon you demanded for the party. And you're sending $5,000 to Julian so he can manage assets? Julian and Sophia are building something. They have images to maintain. They're in New York, Arthur. It's expensive." Margaret hissed, her face reddening. "You're a delivery driver. You're fine where you are. A mother has to look out for her children who are still climbing." "And what am I?" Arthur asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Am I not your child?" "You're the man of the family," she said, as if that explained everything. "It's your duty to give. Theirs is to grow." Arthur didn't say another word. He turned and walked out of the library, past his father who was still staring at the newspaper, and out into the cold Providence afternoon. He drove home, but he didn't go inside. He sat in his truck in the driveway as the snow began to fall, dusting the windshield in white. He felt a hollow, aching void where his loyalty used to be. For 26 years, he had believed he was the pillar holding the roof up. Now in the fading light, he finally saw the truth. He wasn't a pillar. He was an ATM with a pulse. He was the silent engine that everyone used but no one bothered to oil. And he realized that as long as he kept pumping his blood into their lives, Clara would continue to bleed. Standing there in the growing darkness of his own driveway, Arthur looked at his calloused, oil-stained hands. They were the hands of a man who had been forgotten in his own family's ledger. The Thanksgiving air in Providence was brittle and sharp, with a gray sky that threatened to spill heavy snow onto the historic cobblestones. Inside Arthur's house, the heat from the oven was a suffocating blanket, thick with the scent of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and the sweet, cloying aroma of candied yams. This was the day the family gathered, not out of love, but out of a rigid adherence to a script written long before Arthur was born. Clara had been on her feet for 12 hours straight. She had finished her late shift at the supermarket at dawn, only to transition immediately into the role of head chef for a party of 12. Her apron was stained with turkey fat, and her face was a ghostly shade of porcelain, her eyes sunken into dark hollows of pure exhaustion. Arthur watched her from the kitchen doorway, his heart aching with a mixture of guilt and simmering fury. He had spent the morning trying to help, but his mother, Margaret, had shooed him away, insisting that men have no place in a Thanksgiving kitchen, while simultaneously critiquing the way Clara basted the bird. The guests arrived with the usual New York flourish. Julian and Sophia entered like visiting royalty, shedding their designer wool coats and handing them to Arthur as if he were a cloakroom attendant. Julian was accompanied by a new face this year, Marcus, a polished, sharp-jawed business consultant with a smile that felt as artificial as the veneers on his teeth. Marcus was the kind of man who measured everyone he met by the cost of their watch. "Art, my man, looking hard-working as ever," Julian said, clapping Arthur on the shoulder with a patronizing grin. "Listen, Marcus here, and I have a huge project on the horizon, a complete overhaul of the firm's logistics. It's a gold mine." Arthur nodded silently, his fingers tightening around the coats. He led them into the living room, where his father, Henry, sat in his usual throne-like chair. The afternoon was a blur of superficial laughter and the clinking of wine glasses. In the kitchen, the atmosphere was far more grim. Clara was wrestling with a heavy porcelain platter, her hands trembling so violently that the gravy boat rattled against the side. "Clara, the mashed potatoes need more cream. They're a bit rustic," Sophia called out from the dining room, her voice carrying that effortless tone of someone who had never mashed a potato in her life. Clara didn't respond. She just leaned her head against the cool surface of the refrigerator for a split second, her eyes closed. As the family finally sat down for dinner, the table was a masterpiece of Clara's labor. The turkey was golden brown, the sides were seasoned to perfection, and the wine, paid for by Arthur's credit card, flowed freely. "A toast to the family," Henry declared, raising his glass, "and to Julian's new venture. May the name continue to prosper." Halfway through the meal, the conversation took a turn that Arthur had been dreading. "Arthur," Henry said, setting his glass down with a heavy thud, "Julian mentioned the expansion. Marcus here has secured the contracts, but they need a bit more liquidity to close the deal. As the eldest, it's only right that you step up. I want you to give Julian a loan. 30,000 should cover the initial overhead." The table went silent. Arthur looked at his father, then at Julian, who was casually sipping his wine as if he hadn't just asked for his brother's life savings. 30,000? Arthur asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't have 30,000, father. My truck is dying, and Clara needs medical attention for her back." "Oh, don't be dramatic, Art," Julian chimed in, waving a hand dismissively. "You've always been the steady one. You have equity in the house. You can take out a line of credit. It's for the family's future." "A line of credit?" Arthur repeated, the fury in his chest beginning to boil over. Just then, Clara emerged from the kitchen carrying a heavy tray of desserts. Her face was no longer pale. It was a waxy, translucent gray. She took 2 steps toward the table, her knees buckled, and she collapsed. The tray hit the floor with a deafening crash, porcelain shattering into 1,000 white shards as the tarts scattered across the rug. "Clara!" Arthur screamed, diving across the room to catch her head before it hit the floor. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged. Arthur pulled her into his lap, his hands covered in berry filling and broken crust. "Ugh, what a mess," Vanessa groaned, pulling her chair back to avoid the stains on her silk dress. "Is she okay?" Sophia asked, not moving from her seat. "She's probably just had a bit too much wine, or maybe her blood pressure dropped from the heat." "Honestly, Clara, we were just about to eat dessert." "She doesn't drink wine while she's working," Arthur hissed, his eyes fixed on Clara's limp form. "Art, let's get her to the sofa," Julian said, looking at his watch. "She'll wake up in a minute. Marcus and I still need to go over those figures before the flight back to Manhattan. Don't let this ruin the evening." Something inside Arthur finally snapped. It wasn't a clean break. It was a violent, jagged tear of every tie that had held him to this table. He gently laid Clara on the rug and stood up. He walked to the hallway, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out the navy blue bank book he had taken from his mother's desk. He walked back into the dining room. The silence was absolute. He threw the book onto the center of the table, where it slid across the polished wood and came to a stop in a puddle of spilled wine. "What is this?" Henry asked, squinting at the book. "That's the family's future," Arthur spat, his voice trembling with a rage that had been brewing for 26 years. "I found it. Thousands of dollars every month, Father. Wires to Julian, wires to Sophia, all while you told me you were broke, all while Clara sold her jewelry to keep my truck running so I could keep sending you money for these traditions." Margaret's face went white. "Arthur, you have no right." "I have every right," Arthur roared, slamming his fist onto the table so hard the glasses jumped. "I am the one who worked the 4:30 a.m. shifts. I am the one who paid for this turkey, this wine, and your organic medicine. And you have the nerve to ask me for more? To give to Julian, who has been bleeding you dry while I stayed silent?" Julian opened his mouth to speak, but Arthur pointed a shaking finger at him. "Shut up, Julian. Not a word. You buy a $100,000 car while your brother eats instant noodles to pay for your father's standing in this town." Arthur turned back to his father, who was staring at him in stunned silence. "I'm done," Arthur said, his voice suddenly cold and quiet. "This house, these GIO chap, these rules, they're over. As of this second, this family doesn't have an eldest son. It doesn't have a man of the family. It just has people who have to learn how to cook their own damn dinner." He knelt back down, scooped Clara up into his arms, and walked out the door without looking back. The cold Providence air hit his face, and for the first time in his life, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a clean slate. Behind him, the house remained silent, the broken porcelain on the floor a testament to the life he was finally leaving behind. The drive from Providence to the rugged coastline of Maine was a journey of silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the truck's tires against the asphalt and the whistling wind of a New England winter. Arthur drove with a singular focus, his hands steady on the wheel for the first time in years. In the passenger seat, Clara was wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her head resting against the window as she watched the urban sprawl of Rhode Island dissolve into the dense, snow-dusted pines of the north. They had left everything behind: the shattered porcelain on the dining room floor, the unanswered calls vibrating on the dashboard, and the crushing weight of 26 years of duty. Their destination was a modest, weather-beaten cottage in a small fishing village near Kennebunkport. It was a place Arthur had found through a fellow driver years ago, a sanctuary where the salt air was thick enough to taste, and the only schedule was dictated by the tides. As they crossed the state line, Arthur reached over and turned off his cell phone. The screen went black, silencing the barrage of messages from Julian and Sophia that had been lighting up the cabin like a frantic heartbeat. "Are you sure about this, Arthur?" Clara asked softly, her voice still weak but possessing a newfound clarity. "I've never been sure of anything else in my life," he replied, glancing at her. "For 26 years, we've lived for everyone else. It's time we live for us." They were met at the cottage by Captain Elias, a retired lobster man with a face like a topographical map of the Atlantic, skin toughened by decades of sea spray, and eyes that had seen more storms than any man should. He held the keys out to Arthur with a gnarled hand. "Heard you folks needed a bit of the quiet," Elias rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "The woodpile's stocked and the stove's ready. Just mind the wind when it comes off the bay." "Thank you, Captain," Arthur said, feeling the weight of the key in his palm. It felt heavier than the truck's ignition, yet infinitely lighter. The first week was a haze of recovery. Arthur spent his days tending to the wood stove and preparing simple meals, not the elaborate feast demanded by his mother, but bowls of hearty soup and fresh bread. Clara spent her time on the porch, wrapped in layers of fleece, her gaze fixed on the gray expanse of the ocean. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, her hands were not submerged in soapy water or covered in flour. One morning, before the sun had even dared to peek over the horizon, Arthur woke to find the bed empty. Panic flared in his chest for a fleeting second before he saw the porch door slightly ajar. He found Clara standing at the railing, the air so cold it turned their breath into silver mist. "Look, Arthur," she whispered. The sun was beginning to bleed over the edge of the Atlantic, a deep bruised orange that turned the dark waves into molten copper. There was no alarm clock chirping at 4:30 a.m. There was no delivery manifest to check, no frantic call from his mother about premium salmon, and no nagging guilt about a radiator he couldn't afford to fix. Arthur wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her close. "I promised you this a long time ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You kept it," she replied, leaning her head back against his shoulder. "It just took us a while to find the map." While peace reigned in Maine, a different kind of storm was brewing back in Providence. At the historic family home, the absence of the eldest son and the perfect daughter-in-law had created a vacuum that none of the remaining family members knew how to fill. The next scheduled family gathering, a memorial service for a distant great-aunt, had become a theater of the absurd. Without Arthur to coordinate the logistics and Clara to handle the kitchen, the house had fallen into a state of paralyzed chaos. Julian sat at the mahogany dining table, his expensive silk tie loosened, staring at a pile of utility bills that had gone unpaid for 2 months because Arthur was no longer there to manage the household fund. "What do you mean the water might be shut off? Mjrna," Margaret hissed, her voice lost its frail quality and was now sharp with panic. "Arthur always handles the utilities." "Well, Arthur isn't here, Mother," Julian snapped, his face flushed with frustration. "I tried to call him, but the phone is disconnected. I don't even know where the account numbers are kept." In the kitchen, Sophia was having a meltdown of her own. She stood before the massive professional-grade oven, holding a cookbook as if it were an ancient, undecipherable relic. Tabitha, Julian's teenage daughter, a girl who spent most of her life behind a screen and had never seen a raw turkey in person, watched from the doorway with a mixture of amusement and horror. "Aunt Sophia, I think the smoke alarm is going off," Tabitha said, pointing to the thin wisps of black smoke curling out of the oven. "I followed the instructions," Sophia cried, waving a spatula frantically. "It said 350 degrees. Why is it burning?" "Did you take the plastic off the bird?" Tabitha asked dryly. The kitchen was a disaster zone of half-chopped vegetables, spilled flour, and unwashed dishes that had begun to pile up in the sink like a mountain of failure. Julian walked in, holding a bill for the lawn service that was 3 weeks overdue. "Sophia, we need to talk about the budget," Julian said, his voice strained. "Father says we need to contribute to the memorial fund this month, since Arthur isn't paying. It's $600 each." "$600?" Sophia shrieked, dropping the spatula into a puddle of gravy. "I have my gallery opening. I can't just throw money at groceries. That's what Arthur does." "Arthur isn't doing it anymore," Julian roared, slamming the bill onto the counter. "He left. He actually left. And now we're stuck in this house with no food, a burning bird, and a pile of debts we didn't even know existed." Henry watched the scene from his chair in the living room, the silence of the house now replaced by the jarring sound of his children's bickering. For the first time, he saw the success he had bragged about for what it truly was, a fragile facade built on the back of a son he had never truly thanked. Back in Maine, as the sun fully rose over the water, Arthur and Clara turned their backs on the horizon and walked into their warm cottage. The only sound was the crackle of the wood stove and the distant cry of a seagull. The migration of their hearts was complete. They had finally found home. The winter in Maine had a way of stripping life down to its essential bones. For Arthur and Clara, the months spent in the coastal cottage had been a slow, quiet reconstruction of their souls. The saltwater air had acted as a balm for Clara's back, and the absence of a delivery manifest had finally allowed the tremors in Arthur's hands to subside. However, the peace was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when a familiar, sleek SUV, now covered in the gray salt and slush of a long winter drive, pulled into the gravel driveway. Arthur stood on the porch, a stack of firewood in his arms, watching as Julian stepped out. But this was not the Julian who had left Providence months ago. His designer coat was rumpled, his hair was unkempt, and the arrogant sheen in his eyes had been replaced by a hollow, haunted look. "Art," Julian said, his voice cracking as it met the cold Maine wind. "Julian?" Arthur replied, his voice neutral. If you're here for a loan, the answer hasn't changed. Julian shook his head, a jagged, painful breath escaping his lungs. Father had a stroke, Art, 2 weeks ago. The wood in Arthur's arms felt suddenly heavier. He led Julian inside, where Clara was sitting by the stove. Julian didn't wait to be asked to sit. He dropped to his knees on the hardwood floor, the sound of his knees hitting the wood echoing like a gunshot in the small room. "I didn't know," Julian sobbed, his face buried in his hands. "I didn't know how much you did." "We tried, Art. Sophia and I, we tried to run the house. We tried to manage the bills and the services and Mother's demands." He looked up, his face wet with tears. "The power went out because I forgot the payment. Mother fell because she tried to make tea herself and didn't know where the step stool was. And Father, he just sat there, calling your name, every hour, just calling for Arthur." Dr. Eris Thorne, the family's longtime physician in Providence, a man with a penchant for blunt truths and a deep respect for Arthur's quiet endurance, had been the one to finally talk sense into the siblings. He had told Julian that the stress of the household's collapse had likely accelerated their father's condition. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. "Mother asked me to give you this. She wrote it herself. It took her 3 days." Arthur opened the letter. Margaret's handwriting, usually so sharp and demanding, was shaky and frail. "Arthur, my son," the letter began, "we took your kindness and used it as a bridge for your siblings to walk over. We mistook your silence for lack of pain and your strength for a lack of need. We were wrong. We broke the heart of the only child who truly stayed. Please, if you can find it in you, forgive a mother who was too blind to see the treasure in her own driveway." Arthur passed the letter to Clara. As she read it, her eyes filled with tears, her hand going to her mouth. Julian stood up, wiping his face, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled a set of legal documents from his briefcase. "Marcus and we're not working together anymore. I realized he was just another version of the person I had become, someone who only sees value in numbers." "What is this, Julian?" Arthur asked, looking at the papers. "It's a trust," Julian explained, his voice gaining a bit of professional steadiness, though his eyes remained soft. "I went back through the bank books, all of them. I calculated every wire transfer, every investment Mother and Father sent to me and Sophia over the last decade." He pointed to a figure on the page, a staggering amount. "I'm liquidating my New York assets. The SUV is already gone. Sophia is doing the same with her gallery's private collection. We are paying it back, Art, every cent. It's being put into a high-yield retirement fund for you and Clara." "Julian, you don't have to," Arthur started. "I do," Julian interrupted firmly. "And there's more. I've had a lawyer draft a new will for Father and Mother. The Providence house, the estate, it's to be divided equally, 3 ways. No more eldest son inheritance rules. No more burdens. From now on, the cost of their care is split 3 ways, and I've already hired a full-time nursing staff, so Clara never has to touch a dish in that house again." The silence that followed was not the heavy, suffocating silence of Providence, but something lighter, the silence of a debt finally acknowledged. Arthur looked at his younger brother and saw for the first time a man instead of a caricature of success. "Father is at the New England Rehabilitation Center," Julian said softly. "He can't speak much, but he's stable. He wants to see you, both of you." Arthur looked at Clara. She nodded, her hand resting on his. "We'll come," Arthur said, "not because of the money, Julian, but because it's time to stop running." As Julian drove away, the gravel crunched under his tires, leaving the main cottage in peace once more. Arthur sat back down by the stove, the legal papers on the table. He didn't feel rich. He felt heard. For 26 years, he had been the invisible engine. But today, the family had finally looked under the hood and realized how much he had been carrying. The transition from the rugged, salt-sprayed isolation of Maine back to the historic streets of Providence felt like waking from a long, restorative dream into a reality that had been scrubbed clean. It was early spring now. The stubborn New England ice had finally surrendered, giving way to the tender green of budding maples and the vibrant yellow of crocuses pushing through the thawed earth. For Arthur, the change was most profound in the quietest moments. He still woke early. His internal clock was a machine hewn from decades of habit. But the sharp, adrenaline-fueled panic of the 4:30 a.m. alarm was gone. Now he woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains and the steady, peaceful breathing of Clara beside him. He no longer felt like a soldier preparing for a battle he was destined to lose. He felt like a man who owned his time. On this Sunday, the family was not gathering at the old house with its suffocating traditions and piles of dishes. Instead, they met at The Hearth, a bright, airy restaurant in downtown Providence, known for its floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the river. Arthur sat at the head of the long table, dressed in a crisp linen shirt. Beside him sat Clara, and for the first time in 26 years, Arthur couldn't stop looking at her hands. They were resting on the white tablecloth, no longer red and raw from lie or shaking from exhaustion. She wore a soft lavender silk dress, and her skin looked luminous. She had spent the morning at a spa, a gift from Sophia, and her nails were neatly manicured, a small but powerful symbol of her reclaimed dignity. Leo, the restaurant's head server, a man with a gentle demeanor and an uncanny ability to anticipate a guest's needs, approached the table with the check. Before the folder even touched the wood, Julian reached out his hand. "I've got this, Leo. It's on me today," Julian said. His voice lacks the boastful edge it once carried. "Actually, Julian," Sophia interrupted, pulling out her own card with a smile that finally reached her eyes. "We agreed to split the family accounts now, remember? It's 3 ways." Julian chuckled, a genuine warm sound. "Right. Habit. Thirds it is." Arthur watched this exchange with a quiet sense of wonder. He looked down the table. Sophia and Vanessa were huddled together with Clara, not barking orders for tea, but laughing over a tablet screen. They were planning a girls' weekend in the Berkshires, debating between a hiking retreat or a gallery tour. "Clara, you have to choose the hotel," Vanessa said, leaning in. "Your taste is much better than ours. We've been too busy looking at price tags to notice beauty." The conversation at the table was light, floating over topics like upcoming vacations and community projects. There was no talk of investments that were actually bailouts, and no talk of standing that required someone else's blood to maintain. At the end of the table sat Henry and Margaret. Henry was in a wheelchair now, his movements slow, but his mind was clear. He reached out and placed his hand over Arthur's. "The salmon was good, Arthur," Henry said, his voice a bit gravelly, but sincere. "But the company is better." Margaret leaned over and caught Arthur's eye. She didn't say anything, but she squeezed his arm, a silent acknowledgement of the bridge he had allowed them to build back to him. As the meal ended, Julian pulled Arthur aside by the window. "The retirement fund is fully vested, Art, and the nursing staff for Mom and Dad is working out great. Sophia and I are alternating weekends to handle the administrative stuff." "And your business, Julian?" Arthur asked. "It's smaller, leaner," Julian replied, looking out at the river. "But I can sleep at night, and I can look at you without feeling like a thief. That's worth more than the SUV." After saying their goodbyes, Arthur and Clara walked out into the bright afternoon. They didn't head toward a delivery truck. They headed toward their own car, a reliable, well-maintained sedan that didn't hiss or rattle. Arthur drove them toward the Boston Overlook one last time before heading home. They parked the car and walked to the edge of the terrace. Below them, the city of Boston was spread out like a jewel-encrusted map. The heavy, suffocating fog that had defined Arthur's life for so long had completely vanished, burned away by a relentless spring sun. The golden light hit the glass towers and the old brick streets, turning the city into a place of warmth and possibility. Arthur looked at his hands. They were still calloused, still the hands of a man who knew hard work, but they were steady. He reached out and took Clara's hand. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think that being the eldest meant carrying the world so no one else had to feel the weight." "And now?" Clara asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Now I know that a family is only strong when everyone carries their own heart," he replied. "Forgiveness didn't just fix them, Clara. It set us free." He leaned down and kissed her temple. The air was sweet with the scent of blooming lilacs. For 26 years, they had lived in the shadows of a myth that demanded sacrifice. Today, they stood in the light of a truth that offered grace. Arthur looked out at the horizon, not at the road he had to travel for work, but at the life they were finally going to live for themselves. The light of Providence was no longer a distant hope. It was the very ground beneath their feet. The story of Arthur and Clara reminds us that silence is not always peace, and endurance is not always a virtue. In our daily lives, we often confuse carrying the load with loving the family. But true love does not require the slow destruction of one person for the comfort of others. Setting boundaries is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of restoration. When we find the courage to speak the truth, we give others the chance to grow, and we give ourselves the permission to heal. Remember, a family is at its strongest, not when one person carries the world, but when every heart shares the weight of the journey. If Arthur and Clara's journey touched your soul today, please show your support for stories of strength and family growth. Like this video to help spread the message of hope. Share it with someone who might be carrying a heavy burden in silence. Comment below with your thoughts on today's lesson. We love hearing your personal stories. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of these heartfelt American myths. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the light that follows the longest nights. We ask for your special blessing upon every person watching this today. For those who are weary, grant them rest. For those who feel forgotten, remind them of their worth. And for every family struggling with the shadows of the past, bring the warmth of your grace and the clarity of your truth. May we all find the strength to walk in the light of providence together. If you believe that love and justice will always find a way home, please write Amen in the comments below.